The last thing I need to do while I'm up here is introduce someone to you. And when I was thinking about this symposium today, it actually, of all things, made me think about our Gainsborough exhibition that we had 3 years ago. And for that exhibition, which is still, I think Amy Galpin is here, her and I talk about that Hodgkin-Gainsborough exhibition as one of the highlights at the museum from our time here. That was the show that we did our first Symposium 4 of this symposium program that you are now at today. And we did that with our friends, such as John Wilson over at the Timken Museum. But that was really an effort that was guided and directed by Julia Margiari-Alexander and definitely by John Margiari. And this is a man who surprised me on a personal level because I was like, why is this curator so interested in the education department? But it is because he is a big picture thinker and he gets it and he understands that if you want great exhibitions, you need great programs to go along with them. If you want a great museum, you need great collections and a way to show them off to people and explain that material to people through programming. And so even though I find myself in a different department than him, he has surely been a mentor to me. Now, why do I bring that all up? Of course, this is our last symposium with Dr. John Margiari, who will be leaving to join his wife on the East Coast in June. And so it is for that very reason that we are all here today at this type of symposium program. It is for his selflessness, for his guidance, for his leadership, and for his incredible passion and knowledge that he has shared, not just with this museum, but with all of us in San Diego for the last 5 years, that I would like your help in thanking Dr. John Margiari.
Thank you all. That was unexpected for a number of ways. One of which is that it preempted the comment that I wanted to make to begin. As most of you know, Julia and I are going to be leaving. In fact, yesterday was Julia's last official day at the museum. So she's here this morning on a kind of busman's holiday because she actually does like this stuff. But this kind of exhibition, an exhibition that has, we hope, broad public appeal, but that also a real scholarly heft, and that meshes so well with our collection, with the great run of 18th century Italian paintings in the upstairs gallery, is just the kind of program that Julia was brought here to create in her position as Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs, and along with that exhibition, along with all these exhibitions, of course, the symposia, where I might occasionally be useful in naming this or that person and bringing them along, but the symposia simply wouldn't have happened had Julia not created that initiative when she arrived as Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs. So at the risk of meddling or muddling personal and professional, I wanted to start today by asking you all to acknowledge Julia's 5 years at the museum. Piranesi is an incredible character. He is a sort of polymath of the sort that you find in the 18th century and maybe not before, with very few exceptions. He is someone whose career can be studied in many ways, and what I've tried to do with the symposium today is bring together a combination of scholars who are, some of whom are deeply expert in Piranesi and have published many things on Piranesi, and others of whom are specialists in 18th century Rome or one or another aspect of 18th century Rome, so that you would have here both the reflections of someone who's been thinking about and writing about Piranesi for years and years and years, but then also people who know so much about the period but haven't necessarily published on Piranesi per se. To try to give a sense of the layering of his career, of the many aspects of his work. Now, all of these programs, all of these exhibitions, the possibility of bringing scholars here from places as far away as Princeton or Virginia or New York City are supported by a great many people. In this particular case, for the symposium, we have received the support from the Italian government as part of the Year of Italian Culture in the United States. To say a few more words about that, I'd like to invite to the podium Alberto Di Mauro, who is the director of the Istituto Italiano di Cultura in Los Angeles. So please join me in welcoming him.
Good morning, everyone. So as said, this is the Year of Italian Culture. That means that in all over the States, there is a series of flourishing events, and not only in California, but all over. But just to stay in California, for example, just to give an example, we had a few days ago an exhibition at the Getty Museum about Florence and the dawn of Renaissance. We had at LACMA Museum an exhibition about Caravaggio. We are going to have in 3 days the opening of an exhibition about Sicily between Greece and Rome, opening at Getty Villa. So this event is in the framework of the Year of Italian Culture in the States, and I'm very pleased because it's a fantastic exhibition, not only for, I have to say, for American people, but also for Italian. I'm Italian, I live in Rome. If you go in Rome, you go to the public offices, ministries, at least in the 60s, there was the idea to have in the main rooms, always some prints of Piranesi. So we get a little bit, I don't say, but a little bit depressed to see all the time Piranesi, because it was something quite official. So when I thought exhibition by Piranesi, I mean, I was not really excited. But now I was last night, I went to this exhibition. It's like to open a new world, like to see a new Piranesi with new eyes, because you can notice, it's stressed very much, this theatrical invention of Piranesi. You can see from this exhibition the modernity of Piranesi. And you can understand also many things of contemporary modern art now, because we depend from this invention, from this creativity of Piranesi. So I'm very pleased with this exhibition. I will come all the speakers today, and I want to say this is also a good occasion for the Italian Culture Institute to open relationships, collaboration with the San Diego Museum of Art. This is the main first collaboration, but I'm sure that is not the first one. Will be many others. So thank you very much, and enjoy this morning. Thank you. Bye.
Many of you have heard me explain before that one of the great pleasures of my job is bringing friends here to San Diego to take part in our programs. And we were trying to do the math a bit last night, but our first speaker and I have known each other, we figured out, for at least 20 years, which makes us both feel perhaps older than we look. Possibly more. We wouldn't want you to do too much math on that. Jeffrey Collins and I first met as graduate students at Yale 20 or 20-something years ago. He is educated at Yale and Cambridge and is now a professor and chair of academic programs at the Bard Graduate Center for Decorative Arts, Design History, and Material Culture in New York, an institution that I'd like to think would be very close to Piranesi's own heart. It's an institution that studies the many facets of design, just in exactly the same way that the exhibition does here. Jeffrey is a fellow of the American Academy in Rome, as indeed are all three of our speakers, which is another kind of point of commonality between us all. We've all known each other in one or another way in connection with the American Academy, which is an institution, again, that I think Piranesi would appreciate. It's something like the Café degli Inglesi. It's the place where people go in Rome and talk about what they're learning from a variety of perspectives: archaeological, architectural, historical, art historical, etc. It is an institution very much in the spirit of the 18th century and that encyclopedic mentality of combining the many facets of learning. Jeffrey's research concentrates especially on the formation of early museums, the Vatican Museum and others in Rome. That was the subject of his book, Papacy and Politics in 18th Century Rome, Pope Pius VI and the Arts. Today, though, he's going to turn his eye on Piranesi, deliver a talk entitled More is More, Piranesi and Design. Please welcome Jeffrey Collins.
Thank you very much. First, let me thank the director, Roxana, for your warm welcome. And to John, this is really more like a reunion of friends than a symposium to me at the moment. Let me say also it's an honor to share the stage with my friends, Professors Pinto and John. And I should say that I learned most of what I know about the 18th century from these two men, so you're in great hands. I think the second part of my title fell away in the brochure that you have in your hands, but that's okay. I thought I would start by talking about the first part of the title, More is More. Now, you're probably more familiar with the phrase, less is more, and of course that is the great ethic adopted by pioneering modernists like Adolf Loos or Walter Gropius or Le Corbusier, really orienting a lot of design thinking throughout the 20th century. But by the 1960s, I think you also know that people were a little oppressed by all of this minimalism, and I think it was Robert Venturi who in 1966 said, less is a bore. And by 1985, Robert Stern, another important postmodernist architect, had formulated the official credo that I want to adopt, and I think Piranesi would have agreed with, more is more. So that's what I want to talk about today, and I think it's certainly well illustrated by this title page, which I've cribbed from Piranesi. It will come back in the course of my talk. But I think it illustrates what I wanted to do in my remarks today, which is certainly to illustrate this idea, to showcase Piranesi's design genius, but also to put him in context. And I mean by that both chronological context, to think about him as an 18th century designer, but also geographical context, someone in the continent, in Rome, at a time when ideas of all kind were really circulating north and south and east and west. And so without taking away from his achievement or from the central thesis of the show, which is really stressing his creative originality, I'd like to put it to you that he didn't, in fact, land from Mars in 18th century Rome, but he really participated in design ideas, design philosophies that were actually sweeping Europe at the time, and not always, in the ways that we would necessarily expect. So, since I'm the first speaker, it falls to me to at least introduce this figure. I don't know how familiar he is to you. He was born in 1720 in Venice, into a family that worked in an architectural profession, or at least a building profession, and died in 1778 in Rome. And in between those roughly 60 years, I think it's fair to say that he really taught his fellow Europeans to see antiquity in a new way. And we're going to be hearing a lot more about that, I think, in the next two talks. Probably many of you arrived here today thinking of him as a printmaker, and certainly numerically in the exhibition that is next door, that is the bulk of his output. Again, that's something we're going to hear a lot about, but I wanted to focus today on how he wanted to be known, which was as an architect. And so I start with this 1750 portrait. This is a print that was used as the frontispiece to his first edition of the Antichità Romane, the Antiquities of Ancient Rome. And I'll just show you also. What I'd like you to notice is the use of the word architect. He really is signing himself as architect, both in this first edition and then in the late 1770s edition. He also returns to that and really wanted to be known as architect. That's how he signed his plates, primarily. And it really was, in a sense, the title and the profession, that he was aspiring to. We need to complicate that label a little bit because I think it was Siegfried Gideon who said, "I am a great architect because I do not build." I think it was Adam Lowe. Piranesi fits into that category. I think Adam Lowe called him an architect manqué, someone who really longed to build, but was really frustrated for situations that were beyond his control. He did build a bit, and I'll show you a little bit of that, but I think the point is that in the 18th century, the architectural practice encompassed all sorts of other areas of design that did not involve, piling blocks. And in fact, it's that activity as an architect stroke designer really at the core of his work that I want to focus on today. Let me start by showing you some of his early architectural, it's not fair to call them designs, they're actually capricci, caprices. It's invented architecture, and I think obviously more is more is a good description of a design like this, where he has an idea and he goes with it, multiplies it almost to a kind of exaggerated degree. And I think that idea of caprice, capriccio, imagination, flight of fancy, very visible here, and I think that's something that would be good to hold in mind for the rest of the talk. So he works up designs like this. Really, it's his way of thinking through a vision of antiquity, and you'll certainly see that in the show and in the other remarks this morning. It applied also to when he came to plan actual structures, or at least virtual structures, like this large and magnificent college, kind of a plan for, I suppose, an 18th century university with all of the faculties distributed in a kind of magnificent way around a central courtyard. Certainly this is more is more. He's not pulling this out of thin air, though. He's linking this in his mind to the precepts that he believed were exemplified by ancient Roman planners. And I just show you this detail from one of his, the sections of the city just north of the Tiber, where he's imagining what ancient Rome would have looked like in its heyday. So he, in fact, is not thinking of this only as a kind of caprice or a flight of fancy, but something that is in some way justified by the spirit of ancient building and planning. If we look at some of his actual work, this is the one building that he really had a chance to construct in the mid-1760s, the Church of Santa Maria del Urato on the Aventine Hill in Rome. I hope some of you have had a chance to see it in person. I think you can see that the relatively flat facade is really being treated as a kind of billboard onto which design ideas are being, pasted. And then certainly in the inside, there's a tremendous sense of decorative richness, and it's a kind of additive design aesthetic. And I just show you here the high altar and one of his early designs for it. And I think you can see that there are enough design ideas in that one altar to have populated half of the churches in Rome, but he combines them all together, and then in execution adds, or has added, a kind of magnificent sculpture that in fact, is an apotheosis, being brought to life in our own way. One of his vehicles in the 1760s through which he communicated some of these ideas was a publication that he called the Parere sull'architettura. Parere is a word that really means opinion. And it's in fact a kind of Platonic dialogue in which Piranesi defended the principle of aesthetic and creative license against those who wanted a much more restrictive mode of design that was faithfully copied from antiquity. Well, he said, yes, we must look at antiquity, but we must also use our own fertile imaginations. You will have to use your imaginations, hopefully not for the rest of this talk. He later illustrated that with some designs for which I'm showing you preliminary drawings. He actually constructed this as a Platonic dialogue between two figures who were espousing these 2 points, and his, I think, idea of this was really defended in a quotation that he put on one of these plates to illustrate this treatise. It's a quotation from the ancient Roman thinker Sallust, and it says, "They despise my novelty, I despise their timidity." So this is, I think, very much the more is more aesthetic. But the key vehicle that I want to talk about today is a later publication of 1769 called the Diverse Maniere d'Adornare I Cammini, Diverse Ways of Ornamenting Fireplaces. And I just show it to you here. It was published as a book. And as you can see, it's really ostensibly about fireplaces, but I hope to convince you it's about much, much more. It's really about invention. And I might just point out, in fact, that these multi-breasted Diana of Ephesus figures, which is in a sense a kind of visual metaphor for the boundless fertility, of nature, but also of the human mind. Here are multi-breasted figures, at least as they were interpreted in the 18th century. So a kind of an icon in a sense of his ideas of creativity. If we move forward, we see that it is ostensibly a book about fireplaces. Here's one of these designs. There are dozens of these in the exhibition, and each of them would repay scrutiny for at least half an hour. So I'll try to move quickly over these. I think you can see that some are amazing in their diversity, but they could in fact be built. They look at least a little bit like fireplaces, and in fact, this publication was part very much of his economic enterprise. He was at the same time as publishing books of fireplaces, manufacturing fireplaces either out of whole cloth or incorporating small elements of antiquity that were radically extended. And here I show you one that he made for the Dutch banker John Hope that's now in the Rijksmuseum. In fact, for someone obsessed with antiquity, fireplaces are a slightly odd choice of vehicle for your ideas, since ancient houses weren't really known to have ornamental fireplaces, and it was in fact a medium that was more associated with France and really with modern design practice. So I think this is quite significant. And in fact, I wanted to draw your attention. I realize it's not very visible here, but the title, it goes on. It's not just fireplaces, it's "and all other parts of buildings." So he's really using the fireplace as a kind of vehicle for getting all sorts of ideas. And if we look then at the prints, we see that around the fireplaces here, he has also put chairs. He's given you suggestions of the types of things you should put on your mantelpiece. So it's really a snapshot of the house, in a sense, and he's giving you an idea of how the whole house should be fitted out. The title also goes on to say that he's drawing from Etruscan sources, from Greek sources, from Egyptian sources, and also from Roman sources. And it's that eclecticism that I really want to be able to show you today. The very newest and most interesting ones are, of course, his Egyptian designs. And we, in the wake of Napoleon's Egyptian campaign and the kind of Egyptomania that swept Europe in the 19th century, we're very used to this. But we have to remember that in 1769, Piranesi was really one of the first to systematically mine Egyptian artifacts for design ideas, of which he piled up into absolutely incredible confections that I think remind us more of Hollywood ideas, of Cleopatra and Elizabeth Taylor than anything the Egyptians would have recognized. And I think I don't mean to make fun of him, but I think he's using this very much as a stimulus to design, not to recover some inherent. I don't think he's deeply interested in the significance of Horus, in this fireplace. It really, I think, is a view of antiquity as a kind of a storehouse that modern designers could raid at will and really recombine. He actually did, in fact, I just love this one. And in fact, we'll come back to it. And what I love, of course, is this wonderful idea that the upper architecture is actually being carried by these two kind of heroic telemon or sort of pharaonic figures. He actually did, it's vanished now, but it was invoked earlier, this Café degli Inglesi, the English cafe in Rome. Building survives, but these interiors, unfortunately, are long gone. They weren't very popular, apparently, with the people who used this room, but they were the first visual statement in Rome of an entire ambiente, an entire environment that was inspired by ancient Egypt, and I think it was probably the best statement of Piranesi's design concept. Now, we think of design and architecture as being two different and sometimes separated spheres in the 20th century, but in the 18th century, again, design, meaning designs of furnishings, of all sorts, were very much part of the architect's brief. The architect was to provide a living environment for his client. So if we go back to the title, The Diverse Ways of Ornamenting Fireplaces, I think it's quite interesting that here we have diverse ornaments that are staged as if they are in an interior, piled up on top of one another. And what I want to do is look a little bit at some of the ingredients of this diverse assemblage. One of them, of course, are antiquities or virtual antiquities. And actually what I'm showing you on the right is a vase that Piranesi manufactured in his workshop or in a related workshop, obviously on an ancient model. And this is very much of the type that he was selling to grand tourists who couldn't get their hands on real antiquities. And in some cases, it's not even clear that they fully understood that what they were buying from Piranesi were not antiquities. So, and that is, in fact, I think, very close to this one that you see here. So antiquity is clearly an ingredient, but interestingly enough, what does he put right above this antiquity but this sconce or wall light, a bras de lumière? And of course, anyone familiar with 18th century French design would recognize this as the key element of the Louis XV style. And just as one example, I'm showing you a similar one from the Hôtel de Soubise, one of the greatest statements of the French Rococo interior in 1730s Paris. And I think you can see that it has this same kind of sinuous inspiration from nature, a really kind of wonderful creativity. You just imagine this growing out of the wall like a kind of a vine or something that's invaded the home in some way. And I think it's this ability to think on both of these registers that makes Piranesi so distinctive as a designer. It's not as strange in the context of his work as you might think, given that he, in the mid-1740s, on one of his return trips to Venice, actually is documented as having worked as an interior designer. And I show you here from the Morgan Library one of his drawings for a Rococo wall panel that incorporates several cartouches. And I think one can, here's a sort of winged figure here, all the design elements that we associate with 18th century French or Italian Rococo style. He clearly did not see this as being fundamentally at odds with antiquity, as we might do today. And I think it, again, shows this ability to balance multiple sources and combine them in free and inventive ways. This is a great drawing. Arguably an even better one is this magnificent drawing for a bucintoro, or a kind of ceremonial barge of the type that the Venetian Doge would use on important outings. Certainly something of great interest to grand tourists, and here's the full design. And I just show you this detail to give you some sense of the skill with which Piranesi mastered this Rococo idiom, not perhaps what we'd associate with the inventor of a certain kind of neoclassicism. Here's a design for a title page with all sorts of ideas, and I just wanted to focus your attention on this one. It's a design for a wall pulpit, in a church attached to a pier, and I think we'd expect to find this more in a German Rococo pilgrimage church, than in the work of Piranesi. But I would put it to you that it's this kind of vertical aesthetic, this piling up of idea upon idea and mass upon mass that really characterizes also his plates in the Diverse Maniere. Now, one of the things that he made that's illustrated in this plate, this table, did in fact survive, and it's to be seen in Minneapolis, and there's a mate to it at the Rijksmuseum. And this was the brief period of his career in the 1760s. I mentioned that he was Venetian. All patronage in 18th century Rome depended on where you were born, and when the Venetian Pope Clement XIII came to the throne, it was Piranesi's day in the sun, in a sense, and he actually got commissions. That was how he got the Urato commission, and that's how he got the commission to decorate an apartment, actually 2 apartments, for the nephews of the Pope, from whence our word nepotism or nephewism. Part and parcel of the papal system. These interiors have also vanished, but we have tantalizing hints that many of the objects that were shown in these plates were in fact produced, and I'm hoping very much that they can be located. The one that survives is this table. Of course, you saw it in the engraving, and I think it really is a great statement of this sort of combination of the Rococo and the all'antica, or the neoclassical mode. It is definitely modeled. This one was actually made for an apartment that was on the Campidoglio in Rome, so in the right in the middle of sort of the heart of ancient Rome, and in some ways also of modern governmental Rome, as opposed to the papacy. And there were already models on this hill of tables in this kind of ancient style, using these monopodia, these winged animal heads with the single foot. And I just show you an example made in bronze, one of a pair that was made and donated on behalf of Benedict XIV to the Capitoline Museum, just a building or so away from Piranesi's work. So he was working in this sensibility, and I think you recognize that these winged figures and these monopods are very much what he's working in. He also had other sources that he knew. This is a later publication from his compendium of vases, but it's very clear that he was interested in this kind of material also in the 1760s. And here you see those same kind of grimacing animal heads, the very ornamental wings, and again, then these muscular monopods with these kind of ball and claw feet. I mean, it's really a very vigorous form of design. I show you this print, and then one of the factum arte realizations or fugues, sort of performances of one of these Piranesian ideas. One actual example that survives is this one. It's a tripod table that was dug up in the excavations of the Vesuvian cities that were buried in the great eruption in 79 AD and systematically recovered in the 18th century. Really the first time that modern Europe had been able to see the household life, the household furnishings, even the perishable ones of ancient dwellings. And this was, of course, a great inspiration. Piranesi recorded one of these secondhand in a publication of 1778. And then here, again, I show you factum arte's realization of his record, and I think you can see again that these are the ingredients on which he's riffing, in a sense, in making this modern table. But I want to point out he's not alone in doing this, and at this very same moment, right across Europe, I can show you as a comparison this sofa that was designed by the great architect James Athenian Stewart, his nickname Athenian because he was one of the few who had actually been to Athens. And he, in attempting to provide all'antica designs for his clients, this is at Spencer House in London, very much mined the same vein of the kind of animal head, the wing, and then the foot. Now, this idea of eclecticism in action, I think to see it, we could look at another plate from this Diverse Maniere, and I just want to point out to you that the background, one of Piranesi's interesting features of these plates is that they really do seem to set his ideas in a domestic interior. This background grotesque work, or sort of arabesque work, is very, very clearly inspired by the type of ancient Roman painting that was being discovered. I think you'll recognize the sort of trellises and tendrils, but I just want to point out he's actually copied quite faithfully specific motifs like this winged horse. Now, if we look, though, at what the furniture that goes with, in his mind, this all'antica wall decoration, he's actually turned again to Rococo models. And here I show you a commode that it seemed to me is particularly close to his designs in its kind of tiptoe stance and rather swelling, bulbous quality, this design for the hunting pavilion near Munich, the Amalienburg. And I think it has much of the same kind of flickering surface quality that Piranesi cultivated in his own designs. If we go back to the book, I think you can see that this collective effect of so many plates, each of which contains so many ideas, is exuberance and fertility and abundance and ingenio. I mean, it's all other parts of buildings that he's cramming into this. And I just want to argue, though, that it's not so different from what was being done 2 or even 3 generations before in Rome. I just compare Piranesi's view of sort of tables piled up with things with this plate from Filippo Passarini's book, of new inventions of ornaments, basically of architecture and all sorts of other things. And I think, again, we see the same kind of tendency to the vertical arrangement and also a little bit this horror vacui. You have a plate, you have a copper plate, you don't want to leave any blank spaces. So in the middle, you fit everything in, and even in these mirrors, it's an empty space, so why not fit in a kind of huge version of a holy water stoup? He's just filling every available space with the abundance of his ideas. So for the rest of the talk, I wanted to zoom in on just one of my favorite plates that I think really exemplifies the diversity in his diverse manners. I think you can see it has a door for a kind of sedan chair. It has a chest of drawers. It has teapots. It has milk pitchers. It has a clock on the back of a rooster, which is, one of my personal favorite ideas. I do think we have to question a little bit whether he actually envisioned that all these things would be built. I think the argument I'm making is it's a polemic, it's a virtuoso performance, not necessarily a set of blueprints. So let me just take you one by one into, I'm sorry this has been cut off, apologize for the technical glitch. I wanted to take you into 3 of the examples that are shown in this plate that have been now realized thanks to the genius of Factum Arte. First is this tripod table, right here, which you can go and see in the exhibition. I think we recognize the style. The ingredients of this are these winged monopod figures from antiquity, and I think you can see that this is, in fact, yet another way of combining or recombining these motifs into, a new use. I think what distinguishes it, though, is a kind of crazy duplication of parts. You not only have 3 legs, which are very, very richly ornamented, but in the middle you have this completely superfluous double helix pendant ornament. It's as if he just thought, well, we can't have the middle of the table be blank. Let's hang something down it. And of course, that's, I think, brilliantly brought to life here in this replica. So density. This is very much in the idiom of that Minneapolis table. The second, and I just, again, want to show you I think Adam can speak to this very well. This is a tiny object, but it has, again, enough sort of ornamental richness, to fill a room. This is very, very much the kind of more is more aesthetic of contemporary designer architects who were working in Rome, also in the 1750s and 60s. And just as one example, I show you one of my favorites, Carlo Marchionni. This is his design for a fireplace surround at the Villa Albani, something that Piranesi would certainly have known. I would just direct your attention to, again, this kind of heaping up of detail, idea after idea after idea, or this design for the upper part of a doorway, which I think is very much in that Piranesian more is more, very 18th century aesthetic with sphinxes and garlands and vases and trophies. The second example that I want to talk to you about is a chair. And I think here again is the image from the plate and then Factum Arte's realization of this. It's a very radical idea, in fact, to use a shell as the basis for a chair. In fact, it may, I suspect, have been chosen precisely because it seemed one of the most radical gestures. And it's clearly derived from Piranesi's interesting but somewhat eccentric theory that the shell and other natural forms were, in fact, the origin motif of all ancient design. It's something he expounds in the very elaborate text that goes along with this, but also gives us in the first plate of the book, where he shows us in a way that even these Etruscan vases, he believed them to be Etruscan, were in some way designed on the principle of ancient shells. I just want to complicate that picture, though, a little bit, because Piranesi was not, in fact, by any means the first to think of using a shell as the basis of a chair. Horace Walpole had a very similar idea for this garden chair. That it's a reconstruction now, but it's something that he had in his suburban villa on the banks of the Thames at Twickenham, Strawberry Hill, that was building in the 1750s, 60s. Certainly Piranesi might have known of this or others, but we needn't posit a particular genealogy from this one. In fact, there was a whole tradition of what were called grotto chairs. Chairs made for, in a sense, pleasure caves, garden pavilions, meant to look natural, constructed with kind of rocks and stalactites. And of course, you didn't want, fancy upholstered furniture in there. You wanted something that looked natural. So these grotto chairs used the motif of the shell, the intertwined dolphins. This is a pair of English examples from about 1740. This is an Italian one, a little bit later, but very much on the same model. And I think if we compare it then to Piranesi's idea, we see that, in fact, Piranesi's recombining ingredients from a quite established design tradition. The third example that I want to talk about is my personal favorite, and if I had a lot of money, this is the one I would buy. It's my favorite object in the show. It's this little pitcher that I think has been interpreted here as a coffee pot. I'm not personally convinced it's a coffee pot. I think the lid is too big, but it's certainly an all-purpose pitcher, or will be. I'm so sorry. I was going to show you again that the shell design, I think, comes back very strongly in this, and in fact, it's very related to this wonderful early design, very free-flowing design that, again, takes the shell motif and kind of riffs on it. The curling, sinuous, it almost looks like a puff of smoke. It's relatively unclear what purpose this drawing is for, but obviously Piranesi used this and realized it in this picture. Again, it's a kind of a radical idea that dematerializes a quotidian object, but I just want to put it to you that he was not the only 18th century artist to think about doing this, and I show you a slightly earlier coffee pot that was made in Paris in the 1750s, so about 10 years before his book of fireplace designs, and this is by the famous French silversmith François Thomas Germain. It's a coffee pot that he designed for the King of Portugal. And I think you can see it has the same kind of swirling interest in vegetal forms, this kind of handle twist, right, that Piranesi's using. We could go further. The vase, obviously in its ancient manifestations, was a great concern of Piranesi, but the vase as a kind of template for showing versatility and ingeniousness in design, especially among architects, was very popular in the 18th century. So architects started publishing suites of vase designs. I don't think they were meant to be built as vases, but they're, again, vehicles for showing ideas. And one of them was a French architect named Petitot, working in Parma, who published a suite of vase designs in 1764. And again, one of them has the same swirl and these very interesting kind of swirly handles. If we look deeper into Petitot's vase designs, we actually find one that has the same intriguing use of these insect attachments. And here in this one, I think they must like whatever's in this vase, and they're trying to get some of it. And I wonder if that bee is not similarly attracted, to the milk or the sweetened beverage, perhaps chocolate or something that is in this pitcher that Piranesi is giving us. One of the funniest aspects of Piranesi's picture is, of course, that it's on the back of a turtle, and I couldn't find one that was on the back, but here's Petitot using the turtle as the finial. Interesting. So it's quite clear that Piranesi knew these designs and was, again, riffing on them. And then, again, to come back to reality, in a rather unexpected location in London, about 9 years before he publishes the design, the great silversmith Paul de Lamery constructed a tureen that was not only in the shape of a turtle, it was probably for turtle soup, but the lid has a finial with, again, a turtle attachment. So not to take away from Piranesi's genius, but he's working a mind that was actually rather common in the 18th century. So I want to come back to this idea of Piranesi as an architect and a designer, because that has often been seen as one of his most radical postures. But I want to put it to you that, in fact, there were many 18th century architects who who actually practiced as designers, or maybe we could flip it on its head and say there were many 18th century designers who really wanted themselves to be seen as architects. And the greatest example of that is Juste Aurèle Meissonnier, born actually in Turin, but practiced mostly in Paris. He was a gold chaser with a craft and manual background, but that's not how he wanted to be known. He wanted to be known as an architect, precisely because the architect is the one who thinks, the craftsman is the one who executes. Piranesi is phrasing himself as the thinker here. He did designs for great churches. This is his design of the facade of Saint-Sulpice on the left bank in Paris, not executed. What was executed were his designs for things like sofas, pier tables, basically everything, snuff boxes, sword hilts, vinegar and oil cruets for the center of your table, salt cellars, soup tureens. You know, this was how Meissonnier expressed his architecture. He's best known for two incredible soup tureens that maybe are known to you. They were made for the Duke of Kingston, a grand tourist, in Paris in the 1730s and shipped over. So these would seem to be absolutely the farthest thing from architecture that you could possibly imagine. Very interesting, then, that although it bears the marks of the silversmiths who made it, it is signed, made by Juste Aurèle Meissonnier, architect. So the concept of what architecture means is that he's the controlling genius. He's the thinker that lays down the plans that others execute. I think that's very much what Piranesi had in mind by that particular use of architecture. I would also show you someone that we know Piranesi actually knew, Louis-Joseph Le Lorrain, one of the pensionnaires at the French Academy in Rome. Piranesi's print shop was originally right across the street. He was actually a painter, but while in Rome in the 1740s, he practiced as a kind of virtual architect, designing fireworks displays like this one from 1747. When he got back to Paris, he couldn't find work either really as a painter or an architect, and so he was put to work as a furniture designer, and I think you can see he took the same motifs and translated them into the realm of furniture. So we have a lot of examples, in fact, of 18th century designer architects. I want to end then by looking a little bit at Piranesi's legacy as a design thinker and how other architects and designers took up the ideas in his text and ran with them. I think these two examples suggest that the way that Piranesi's ideas could take shape actually was versatile and quite varied. And I wanted to start perhaps with this example by a father and son firm of silversmiths, clockmakers, really all-purpose providers of elegant goods for the home, Luigi and Giuseppe Valadier, again a family with the French connection, and this is a family firm that the great furniture historian Alvar González Palacios actually called le mani del Piranesi, the hands of Piranesi, that Piranesi was the thinker and these were his hands. So it's very clear that when they came to design this clock in an Egyptian style, they were deeply inspired by these same ideas that Piranesi 2 decades before had mooted in his book of Fireplaces. The whole idea of making these fanciful but fake hieroglyphs, you know, is very much the mode that Piranesi was advocating. A luxury model that I think in its combination of rich materials like porphyry and gilt bronze is very much what Factum Arte has done in realizing in very rich materials that aristocratic Romans would have liked some of these ideas that appeared in black and white on the page. There are relatively fewer examples of actual furnishings made that can be directly associated with Piranesi. Those tables are the only ones, but it's very clear that a whole host of Roman furniture makers were looking at these designs and making tables, chairs, you know, everything. And here is a painting in a private collection of one of the great female lights of Enlightenment Rome, the Marchesa Boccapaggioli, who has a table, again, in this very Egyptianizing mode that was clearly inspired by Piranesi. If we look abroad, I think you can see that this designer, Thomas Hope, who fancied himself a bit of an architect as well as a designer of household furniture, made for his very eccentric house in London a series of rooms, each in a sense on different themes, the Greek room, the Egyptian room, the Indian room. This is something that was very much in the Piranesian mode, but for his star room, he made this Isis clock, and I think you can see that the whole concept is borrowed, sort of hook, line, and sinker, from Piranesi a couple generations afterwards. And this debt was acknowledged. I would even argue that early 19th century designs that don't seem to have a clear Piranesian inspiration, like this wonderful clock attributed to the bronze maker Philippe Thomire, may have been inspired by that motif that I showed you before, this wonderful idea of carrying, the fireplace, or in this case, the clock, across the room. Let me just end then by showing you some examples of how this transformation actually took shape. And I just want to give you two examples of it before I cede the podium. The first is this tripod that we've seen before. And I think you already saw how Piranesi's plate of this ancient example inspired this replica, this realization, in a sense, by Factum Arte. But it's, in a sense, that same design of Piranesi that inspired Thomas Hope with this design in his 1807 book of household furniture. And this design, in turn, was realized in London by other makers to realize this tripod table that, again, is one of a pair. So it's many generations of sort of filiation and inspiration and copying by which Piranesi's ideas took form. Let me give you a second example that we haven't talked about, and that's the motif of the candelabrum, right? This ornamental candlestick, in a sense, that towers over any of us. It's a key form that interested Piranesi both as an antiquarian, and there's a slippage in that word between the antiquarian scholar and the antiquarian dealer who is selling these actively, especially to English patrons. These really are, if there's anything that's a fugue on an ancient theme, it's these candelabra. They're confections piled up of all sorts of unrelated parts into something that Piranesi firmly believed was in the spirit of antiquity. His record of such a candelabrum from his own workshop, its realization by Factum Arte, and then its translation into a totally different material, in this case painted and carved wood, in London in the 18th century by the great architect designer Robert Adam, again executed by others. And this is a candlestick or candelabrum for the dining room. I'll give you the caption. The dining room of 20 Portman Square, an elegant house in London, and I think you can see what he did. Adam took one of these Piranesi candelabra, he took this tripod design, and in some way kind of joined the two and made something, again, useful. So I think the essence of Piranesi's more is more aesthetic is actually that fragments of antiquity can be combined, and that antiquity is not a recipe book, but it's a book of inspirations. It's a book of ingredients, in a sense. And in fact, I think this principle is so central to his understanding of himself that when Carlo Labruzzi came to paint this posthumous portrait the year after Piranesi's death, he painted Piranesi here with his plans, his drawings of the Greek temples at Paestum, and if my slide weren't cut off, you would see here a little detail of this candelabrum. I think you're just seeing this face right here. This is actually the funerary candelabrum that he wanted to be put over his own tomb, and it's now to be seen in the Louvre. So this was a quick romp through a huge production, but I hope I've suggested how Piranesi's work as a designer related both to his own time, in which he lived and worked, but also that it was really intimately bound up with him, his sense of himself as an antiquarian and a designer. So I will leave it to my colleagues to take it from here, and thank you for your attention.